The 3090 Ti has been released from NVIDIA. The 6950 XT is here from AMD. They are both the respective flagships from each brand, and yet one is significantly more expensive than the other. So does that mean we're going to get performance that's significantly higher? It's time for a good old-fashioned head-to-head, a look at both cards from both teams to see if you had unlimited budget, is it worth going for a refresh card that offers more performance over its predecessor, or spending insane amounts of cash on a product that is honestly out of reach for 99% of consumers, and should have been earmarked more of a productivity card instead? Before we find out, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. So by now we all know what these cards are all about, though if you want to find out more on the 3090 Ti, then the link to our full write-up over on eTeknix.com is down below, and the same for the 6950 XT. We also have a video on the AMD card along with the other RDNA 2 refreshes, so I definitely advise checking that out too, so you can see kind of how it compares directly to other cards in the stack from both AMD and NVIDIA. Whereas today, I'm going to focus solely on the two cards in front of me and see how they do in a battle against each other. A quick recap for those who aren't aware, but the 6950 XT offers slightly more performance over the 6900 XT by taking the original hardware and increasing the game clock and consequently the boost clock by around 3% or so. AMD have also taken the memory clock and given that a slight increase too, from 16 gigabits per second up to 18 gigabits per second. Now AMD also released the 6650 XT and 6750 XT as well, giving similar boosts in speed as kind of one last hurrah before the next generation of GPUs come to market this year. Whereas NVIDIA, after a somewhat delayed launch, released the 3090 Ti, which actually did change a few of the internal specs, including a higher amount of CUDA cores, Tensor cores and RT cores, along with giving the clock speeds, including memory, a nice bump too. Now, for the sake of being completely transparent, both cards here aren't reference by any stretch of the imagination, but are both Gigabyte Gaming OC cards. So when looking at spec for spec and price versus price, they are both evenly matched over a reference spec card. In terms of pricing, things are still a bit shaky in terms of getting stock, but it's safe to say that the 3090 Ti does come in with a premium of well over £600 in the UK and over $700 in the US over the 6950 XT. Which brings me back to my question at the start. Do you get significantly more performance for that extra money? Well, to find out, we put both cards onto our GPU test system featuring an AMD Ryzen 9 5900X with a Noctua D15S to keep it cool, an Asus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero X570 motherboard, and 32 gig of Corsair Dominator Platinum 3600 MHz memory. As always, we've kept resizable bar and smart access memory disabled so that comparisons can be made for those of you with older GPUs who don't have this feature. Both cards were tested on their latest drivers and will run at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. And as always, if you want to see all of the charts, you can do so over on our Patreon, link is down below. So let's get things started with 3D Mark Firestrike, and straight away we see the 6950 XT ahead by just under 10% in comparison to the 3090 Ti. I guess AMD's hope of being the king is already off to a good start, and it's a similar story in Firestrike Ultra, though by a much smaller margin of just under 2%. As we move on to 3D Mark TimeSpy, which does utilise newer technologies, the 3090 Ti manages to come back and pushes ahead of the 6950 XT by around 5%. And in TimeSpy Extreme, it manages to cement that lead even more by 10% over the flagship from AMD. As expected, when it comes to synthetic ray tracing performance, the 3090 Ti decimates the RDNA 2 based card, showing that AMD still has a long way to go if they want to compete with NVIDIA on ray tracing, though if this is important to you, really comes down to personal preference. In our last synthetic benchmark, the 3090 Ti keeps a lead of around 9% over the RDNA 2 based 6950 XT, but synthetics can only show us so much of the story, so let's move on to some games. Starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and at 1080p, the 6950 XT storms ahead of the 3090 Ti at around 33 FPS higher. At 1440p, the gap does shrink slightly, but still shows that the 6950 XT is the superior card. As we move up to 4K, that gap shrinks again down to around 6%, but knowing this card comes in significantly cheaper, I'm not even sure it had to win at this point, making it the best performer for the money. As we move on to an older title and Borderlands 3, and that's where we start to see things move in favour of the 3090 Ti, which comes in with a 5% lead over the 6950 XT. At 1440p, that lead narrows slightly with only a 6 frame per second lead over the 6950 XT. And then at 4K, that lead increases further in favour of the 3090 Ti by around 10%. Moving on to Dirt 5, and at 1080p, the 3090 Ti comes out on top again by 15.5%, showing the strongest lead so far. As we move up to 1440p, we see an even larger gain by 16% over the 6950 XT, and that gap grows even more at around 17% at 4K. These aren't small numbers either when we're talking between 20 to 35 frames per second difference. Moving on to Godfall, and we still see the 3090 Ti push ahead, though the gap has narrowed quite significantly with only a 8.2 FPS difference between the two cards. Moving up to 1440, and that gap grows to around 9% overall in favour of the beastly card from NVIDIA. It's very much the same story at 4K, with a 9% performance variance in favour of the 3090 Ti. It does look like the 3090 Ti really does have this in the bag. Moving over to Horizon Zero Dawn, which is generally favoured by AMD, and that's exactly what we see at 1080p, with a modest 4 FPS gain over the 3090 Ti. Though as we move up resolution, we do see both cards coming in with exactly the same figures, showing that the NVIDIA card is fighting back. And then at 4K, the 3090 Ti storms ahead by 15% over the 6950 XT, showing that its extra memory, faster memory, and overall better throughput really does make a difference. At 1080p in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we see the 6950 XT still has what it takes to be victorious with a 15 frame per second lead over the 3090 Ti. At 1440p, that lead narrows slightly, but still has the 6950 XT ahead by around 3%. And then at 4K, we see the NVIDIA card shoot in front by 10 frames per second, which is around an 8% lead over the 6950 XT. Booting up Watch Dogs Legions, and we again see the 6950 XT ahead of the 3090 Ti, but only by a small 2.4% lead. At 1440p, that lead increases slightly to just under 6%, showing that AMD's tweaks of the clock speeds on the RDNA 2 based card have managed to keep up. Though at 4K we see things change and the 3090 Ti pushes ahead by a small lead of 6.5%. So with rasterization out the way, it's time to look at some ray tracing performance, and I think it's going to be a clear-cut winner here. Starting with Dirt 5 at 1080p, which sees the NVIDIA based card with a healthy 14% lead over Team Red. As we move up to 1440p, that lead further increases to 16% with a nice boost of around 25 frames per second in favour of the 3090 Ti. Finally, at 4K, the green team managed to keep that consistent lead over the 6950 XT, showing that AMD still have a lot to do when it comes to ray tracing. In Godfall, it's very much the same story, though at 1080p, while the 3090 Ti is behind, it's only by a small margin. As we move up to 1440p, the 3090 Ti is able to stretch its legs somewhat, with a 12% lead over the competition. And then furthermore, that lead is increased again to 16% at the larger 4K resolution. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition at 1080p again saw the 24GB monster sitting ahead by a small amount. And as we increase up to a larger 1440p resolution, that gap increases monumentally to just short of 20%. And then at 4K, this shows us a clear disparity between the two cards with a 31% lead to NVIDIA, while AMD trails behind. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legions, we see some of the biggest differences with a 14 frame per second lead in favour of the 3090 Ti at 1080p with ray tracing set to ultra, while 1440p sees a whopping 40% lead, again in favour of the Ampere based card. Lastly, at 4K, we see a colossal difference between the two cards tested here today, with NVIDIA steaming ahead by 52%. So it all looks pretty clear cut. Or does it? Now, before I dissect the results, let's talk a little about the cards, because they're both from the same brand, they're both gaming OC models, and both look very similar, but are somewhat different at the same time. Now, when the 3090 Ti landed with me, I thought it was ridiculous, and to a certain degree I still do. It's not for the faint-hearted, as it's frankly huge, and well beyond what anyone could want or need from a graphics card. I always said that the RTX 3090 was a titan in disguise, and the 3090 Ti just kind of further instills beyond that. For most consumers, it's out of reach, but if I had the money and wanted the very best, then there's no doubt about it. Grabbing a custom card like a gaming OC would be a great choice. It looks great, feels solid, and based on previous gaming OC cards I've used myself, should last the test of time. And the same can be said for the 6950 XT gaming OC. It's cut from the same cloth in terms of the cooler, though it's kind of a slightly slimmed down SKU, though still would put most mid-tier GPUs to shame, at least in terms of its size. Now, whether you're going to go for the AMD based card or the NVIDIA card, you're going to need a hefty PSU, a spacious case, and a good amount of ventilation to keep them tamed. Now, talking about temperature, AMD are generally known to be on the, let's say, warmer side. And with the NVIDIA based card having the bigger cooler of the two, it's no surprise that the 3090 Ti came in 7% cooler overall when compared to the 6950 XT. One thing that was interesting is that the AMD based card came in a couple of decibels quieter, but not really enough to notice. Maybe a small tweak of the fan curve and we could see noise levels on par, as well as temperatures maybe aligning a little bit more too. Now, I did mention you'd need a hefty power supply for either of these two cards, and even with the increased power draw of the 6950 XT over its non-refresh sibling, the 6900 XT, still manages to come in just under 100 watts lower than the 3090 Ti. So it definitely wins in some areas, while as we saw, it lost in quite a few too. Now, I don't see this as having a clear winner or loser, as I think both cards serve very different markets. Firstly, the 3090 Ti is a beast, but it was always meant to be. It's the kind of card that will take anything you throw at it, whether it be rasterization based or with the glitz and glam of ray tracing, and even beyond that, because as I mentioned, it's kind of like a Titan card in drag. The likes of DaVinci Resolve and other productivity focused tasks are going to kind of see it take it all in its stride, but at a cost. While the 6950 XT didn't fare as well in certain tests, it does also come in a hell of a lot cheaper, to the tune of around $900 or £900 or 900 euros. It's a lot of cash that could honestly be better spent in other areas, like more memory, a better CPU, better cooling, and all of these things combined could make up that shortfall between the performance of the 6950 XT and 3090 Ti. Or spend the 900 elsewhere and go on holiday or something. What I'm trying to say is they're both hard to recommend to the average consumer, as they aren't aimed at the average consumer, but instead are aimed at those wanting no compromise, balls to the walls performance. But the 6950 XT is the easier one to recommend, at least based on price. Don't know, what do you think? If money wasn't an object, would you spend the extra £900, euros on the 3090 Ti? Or would you spend it elsewhere? Or maybe you'd simply save it? Or maybe you'd wait for the next generation of cards? So many decisions, I can't frankly answer them for you. Let me know in the comments section below though, what would you do? Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you appreciate the huge amount of work we put into our videos, then support for our Patreon would be fantastic. And don't worry, it won't cost you anywhere near $900. Link is down below. With that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later guys. Bye bye.